The night was cold and eerily silent, broken only by the crunch of dry leaves beneath the feet of two hooded men. Troy and Caleb, fugitives from the state prison, moved like shadows along the dirt road, their restless eyes scanning the darkness. They were exhausted, starving, and desperate. When they spotted a secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere, a predatory grin spread across Troy's cracked lips. "Old man, house in the middle of the woods. This is going to be easy," he whispered. Caleb twirled a knife between his fingers, nodding in agreement. They thought luck was finally on their side. But they were about to realize they had chosen the wrong house. Inside the cabin, Ezekiel Harper, an old man with a white beard and eyes sharp as blades, stirred his hot tea in an iron mug. His wrinkled, calloused hands told stories of war, of battles fought, and enemies defeated. But what truly kept the house safe that night was not just Ezekiel's experience. In the corner of the room, as still as a statue, stood Moloch, a German shepherd trained to kill. His amber eyes reflected the glow of the fireplace, ears pricked, catching every tiny sound. When the faint footsteps broke the silence outside, the dog didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply waited. Troy and Caleb circled the house, each taking a different side. "You take the back door, I'll go through the front," Caleb murmured. Troy nodded, pulling a crowbar from his backpack. They were sure this would be easy. A kicked-in door, a defenseless old man begging for mercy, food on the table, and a safe hideout. But as Caleb turned the doorknob, he realized something odd. The door wasn't locked. His grin widened. Even easier, he thought. He had no idea the door had been left open for a reason. Inside the cabin, Ezekiel took the last sip of his tea and placed the mug on the table. His eyes met Moloch's. No words were needed. The dog stood up slowly, muscles tensed, paws moving silently across the floor. Outside, Troy took a deep breath and kicked the front door open, the wood cracking as it swung wide. But the moment he stepped into the darkened room, a chill ran down his spine. The house was too quiet. A second later, a beastly snarl ripped through the night. Out of nowhere, a shadow lunged from the corner of the cabin, heading straight for Caleb's throat. Moloch attacked without hesitation, his sharp teeth sinking into flesh and bone. Caleb screamed, trying to fight back, but the dog was too fast, too lethal. Troy tried to run, but he barely took a step before he heard the distinct, cold click of a shotgun being cocked. He froze. In the middle of the room, Ezekiel Harper stood firm, gripping his gun, his eyes like stone. "You just dug your own graves, boys," he said with a slow, deadly smile. Outside, Caleb's screams faded into the night. The game had changed. The hunters had become the hunted. Troy stood frozen, his breath shallow, sweat dripping down his forehead. The cold steel of Ezekiel's shotgun gleamed under the dim light of the lantern. Moloch's snarls filled the room, his teeth still buried in Caleb's arm as the fugitive writhed in agony on the wooden floor. Blood stained the old floorboards, the scent of iron mixing with the faint aroma of burning wood from the fireplace. Troy's mind raced. If he moved too fast, the dog would tear into him next. If he reached for his gun, the old man would pull the trigger. He had never felt this helpless before. Ezekiel tilted his head slightly, studying Troy like a predator sizing up its prey. "I've seen that look before," he muttered. "Cornered men always think they're smarter than they really are." His voice was calm, almost amused, as if he had been through this 100 times before. He took a slow step forward, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. "You thought I'd be an easy target. That's your first mistake." He glanced at Caleb, who was barely holding back his screams as Moloch's jaws clamped down harder. "Your second mistake? Thinking I was alone." Troy's fingers twitched, itching to reach for the pistol tucked into his waistband. He knew he had only one chance. If he was quick enough, maybe, just maybe, he could shoot the old man before he pulled the trigger. His heart pounded. One breath, two, then he lunged. But before his hand could even brush against the handle of his gun, Moloch released Caleb and turned on him with terrifying speed. The dog's powerful body crashed into Troy's legs, sending him sprawling onto the floor with a loud thud. His head hit the corner of the wooden table, and for a moment, everything spun. The air left his lungs as he gasped, trying to push himself up. "Bad move," Ezekiel sighed. Click. The shotgun's barrel pressed against Troy's temple, firm and unyielding. "You city boys never learn." Moloch loomed over him, his deep, guttural growls vibrating through the floorboards. The heat of the dog's breath brushed against Troy's face, sending a new wave of terror down his spine. Caleb, still clutching his bleeding arm, tried to crawl toward the door. But before he could reach it, Ezekiel nudged him with the toe of his boot. "You're not going anywhere." His voice was ice-cold. Silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Troy's mind screamed at him to find a way out, but there was none. Ezekiel wasn't just some old man in the woods. He was a hunter, a man who had lived through war, trained to kill, and knew exactly how to control the situation. Every exit was blocked, every escape plan shattered. Troy swallowed hard as reality sank in. They weren't robbing an old man. They had walked into their own execution. A distant sound suddenly echoed through the night, the faint wail of police sirens. Ezekiel smirked, lowering the shotgun just a fraction. "Looks like your time's up," he said. "But don't worry, you won't have to deal with me." He gestured toward Moloch, whose golden eyes burned with merciless hunger. "You'll have to deal with him." Caleb's breathing was ragged, his injured arm trembling as blood dripped onto the wooden floor. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. Troy, still on his knees, felt the cold steel of Ezekiel's shotgun grazing his temple. The room was suffocating, the only sounds being the distant wail of sirens and Moloch's low, guttural growl. The dog stood between them and the door, his stance rigid, muscles coiled like a loaded spring. His amber eyes locked onto Troy's every move, waiting, anticipating the kill. Ezekiel sighed and finally lowered the shotgun, but his grip remained firm. "You boys really thought you could take what's mine and walk away?" His voice was dangerously calm, the voice of a man who had seen death and never flinched. He glanced at the window, where the glow of approaching headlights flickered through the trees. "Cops will be here soon. You got two choices," he continued, his eyes darkening. "Sit tight and let them drag you back to prison, or run." Caleb's head snapped up, confusion flashing in his bloodshot eyes. "Our run?" he stammered. He didn't trust it. This old man had played them like pawns in a game they didn't even realize they were part of. Ezekiel nodded, stepping back and gesturing toward the back door. "Doors open. Woods are thick. Maybe, if you're fast enough, you'll disappear before they get here." His smirk was unreadable. "Of course, that means you'll have to outrun him." He tilted his head toward Moloch, whose ears perked at the challenge. Troy's stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't mercy. This was sport. Ezekiel wanted to watch them run, to let them think they had a chance before he unleashed his monster. The old man leaned down slightly, his eyes locked onto Troy's. "You know what they used to call me in the war?" he asked, voice almost a whisper. "The Houndmaster." He let the words sink in before stepping back and whistling once, short and sharp. Moloch's entire body tensed. The dog lived for the chase. Troy and Caleb didn't wait for a second invitation. They scrambled to their feet and bolted through the back door, their boots kicking up dirt as they crashed into the thick forest beyond the cabin. Branches slapped their faces, the darkness swallowing them whole. Their lungs burned, adrenaline forcing their battered bodies to move. But just as they thought they had a lead, a deep, haunting growl echoed through the trees. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of paws pounding against the earth, closing in fast. Troy chanced a glance over his shoulder, and his blood ran ice-cold. Moloch was coming, and this time there were no chains, no commands, no mercy. This wasn't an escape. It was a hunt, and they were the prey. The forest was a black abyss, branches clawing at their skin as Troy and Caleb stumbled through the thick underbrush. Every breath was a sharp, burning knife in their lungs, but they couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Behind them, the night itself seemed to be alive, filled with the terrifying sound of pounding paws and a low, primal growl that made every hair on their bodies stand on end. Moloch was close. Too close. Troy's mind raced, desperate for a plan. "We gotta split up," he gasped, dodging a fallen log. "He can't chase us both." Caleb, his wounded arm slick with blood, looked at him with wide, frantic eyes. "Are you insane? That thing isn't a dog. It's a damn monster." But Troy didn't wait for an answer. He veered left, crashing through a dense thicket, hoping, praying, that Moloch would follow him instead. He was wrong. Caleb barely had time to react before the shadow exploded from the darkness. One moment he was running. The next, 100 pounds of fury and muscle slammed into his back, sending him sprawling into the dirt. A scream ripped from his throat as Moloch's teeth sank into his calf, dragging him back toward the cabin like a wolf retrieving its kill. He kicked wildly, his boot connecting with the dog's ribs, but it was like kicking stone. Moloch didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his grip and bit down harder. Troy skidded to a stop, his breath caught in his throat as he watched Caleb struggle. He could leave him, save himself. It would be easy, one more body to slow the dog down. But something inside him snapped. He wasn't ready to die in these woods. "Hey!" he roared, grabbing a fallen branch and swinging it with everything he had. The wood cracked against Moloch's side, and for the first time, the beast let go, snarling as he turned his firelit eyes onto Troy. Time froze. The dog's growl rumbled deep, primal. A warning. Promise. Moloch didn't fear them. He enjoyed this. The thrill of the chase. The taste of blood. Troy swallowed hard, knowing this was a fight he couldn't win. Caleb scrambled backward, dragging his injured leg, his face contorted in pain. We have to keep moving," he gasped. But before they could take another step, a familiar sound sent ice through their veins. A whistle. Short, sharp, final. From somewhere in the trees, Ezekiel was calling his hound home. And that could only mean one thing: they weren't running anymore. The game was over. The sharp whistle cut through the night air like a blade, and for a brief moment, everything stood still. Troy and Caleb were frozen in place, their chests rising and falling in ragged breaths. Moloch, his teeth still bared, slowly lifted his head, ears twitching toward the sound. His muscles were coiled tight, his body tense, waiting for the next command. But the worst part wasn't the dog. It was the silence that followed. The realization that Ezekiel Harper was somewhere in the darkness, watching them, hunting them. Troy dared to glance over his shoulder, his stomach twisting into knots. The forest behind them was endless, black and suffocating. They could try to keep running. Maybe, just maybe, they could outrun the old man. But not the dog. Never the dog. Caleb groaned, gripping his shredded leg, blood pooling beneath him. He wouldn't make it. Not far. Not fast. Troy clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had spent his life surviving, conning, stealing, but he had never been prey before. A low chuckle echoed from somewhere in the trees, sending a cold shiver down Troy's spine. "You boys really thought you had a chance?" Ezekiel's voice drifted through the night, calm, patient. He wasn't angry. He wasn't out of breath. He was simply amused. "You see, I don't just train dogs," he continued. "I train killers." His boots crunched against the leaves as he took slow, deliberate steps. "And the thing about a good hound, he don't just chase." He paused. "He finishes." Moloch let out a deep, menacing growl, his body shifting slightly. He was still waiting, still listening. Troy swallowed hard. There was no way out. If they ran, Moloch would tear them apart before they got 10 steps. If they stayed, Ezekiel would decide their fate. His fingers twitched toward the knife in his pocket. But what good would it do against a trained killer and his beast? Caleb was already slumping, his breathing shallow. He was done. Troy was next. And then it happened. The second whistle. Short, sharp, final. Moloch lunged, a black blur of muscle and teeth. Caleb barely had time to scream before the dog was on him again. knocking him back into the dirt. Troy stumbled backward, his legs weak, his heart hammering. But his terror wasn't for Caleb anymore. It was for himself. Because Ezekiel had stepped into the clearing, his shotgun gleaming under the moonlight, his eyes locked onto Troy. "Looks like you're the last one standing," the old man mused, his voice almost disappointed. He lifted the barrel, aiming straight for Troy's chest. "Shame. I thought you boys would put up more of a fight." Moloch snarled, blood dripping from his fangs. Troy finally understood. This had never been about defending a house. This had been a game, and he had already lost. Troy's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, his body paralyzed under Ezekiel's cold, unflinching gaze. The shotgun was steady, unwavering, aimed directly at his heart. Behind him, Moloch growled low and deep, his muzzle slick with blood. His golden eyes locked onto Troy like he was nothing more than another piece of prey. Caleb had stopped moving. Whether he was unconscious or worse, Troy didn't know, and he didn't dare look. The only thing keeping him alive in that moment was the fact that Ezekiel hadn't pulled the trigger. Yet, the old man exhaled slowly, as if considering his next move. "You remind me of a lot of men I've seen before," he murmured, tilting his head slightly. "Men who think they can take what they want, walk over whoever they please." His finger tapped lightly against the trigger. "But the thing about wolves like you is that you always forget. Sometimes you walk into the wrong den." Troy swallowed hard, his mind screaming for a way out. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight. His only weapon was his mouth. Please," he stammered, his hands trembling as he slowly raised them. We didn't know. We just needed food. Place to hide. We weren't gonna hurt you." A bitter smile twisted Ezekiel's lips. "That so?" His voice was quiet, almost amused. "Because from where I'm standing, looks like you were plenty ready to spill some blood tonight." Troy knew pleading wouldn't work. He had to think fast, had to make himself useful. "Listen," he said quickly, desperation creeping into his voice. "You don't have to kill me. I can disappear. You'll never see me again. No cops, no payback. I swear." Ezekiel sighed, as if he had heard this exact line 100 times before. Then, to Troy's surprise, he lowered the shotgun slightly. A flicker of hope ignited in Troy's chest, until he saw Ezekiel's smirk. "All right," the old man murmured. "You can go." Troy blinked, barely able to believe it. His legs felt weak, his stomach twisting as adrenaline surged through his veins. Was this real? He hesitated, waiting for the catch. But Ezekiel simply tilted his head toward the tree line. "Doors open. Go on. Run." The words sent ice through Troy's veins. He knew exactly what this was. The old man had just given the same order to Moloch. Troy bolted, his feet pounding against the dirt as he sprinted into the trees. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body screaming for rest. But behind him, he heard the sound that shattered his last shred of hope. A sharp, piercing whistle. The final command. And then, the sound of paws thundering through the earth. The hunt wasn't over. It was just beginning. Troy's legs burned, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as he tore through the dense underbrush. Branches clawed at his face, thorns ripped into his arms, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Behind him, Moloch was coming. The rhythmic pounding of the beast's paws grew louder, closer, relentless. Troy didn't dare look back. He knew what he would see. A shadow of death, teeth bared, eyes locked onto its prey. Him. The trees blurred around him, his vision tunneling as sheer panic took over. Faster, faster, faster. His lungs screamed for air, but there was no time to breathe, no time to think. He could almost feel the heat of Moloch's breath at his heels, the raw hunger in the dog's snarls vibrating through his bones. Troy had outrun cops, gangs, even bounty hunters, but this was different. This wasn't a chase. This was a death sentence. A flash of movement ahead. A fallen tree, thick and gnarled, blocking his path. He had no choice. With every last ounce of strength, he lunged forward, throwing himself over the log, hitting the ground hard on the other side. Pain shot through his ribs, his vision momentarily blackening. But he had no time to recover. A second later, Moloch slammed into the log with bone-crushing force. The impact was brutal, shaking the ground beneath Troy as the dog let out a furious snarl. Troy scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering, his body begging him to keep running. But then he saw it. Just ahead, through the thick trees, a cabin. Not Ezekiel's. Another one. His pulse spiked with hope. If he could get inside, barricade the door, maybe, just maybe, he had a chance. Ignoring the stabbing pain in his side, he pushed forward, feet barely touching the ground as he sprinted toward salvation. Moloch recovered fast. Too fast. The dog snarled, launching over the fallen tree in a blur of muscle and fury. Troy barely made it to the porch before a set of jaws snapped inches from his ankle. With a strangled cry, he lunged for the door, his fingers fumbling desperately at the handle. It was locked. No, 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 no. He pounded on the wood. Help! Someone! But no lights flickered on. No footsteps approached. He was alone. Behind him, Moloch prowled up the steps, slow, deliberate. The beast's chest heaved, his golden eyes gleaming under the moonlight. He wasn't in a rush. He knew the kill was his. Troy pressed his back against the door, his hands shaking. This was it. No escape. No mercy. Just a killer and his prey. And for the first time in his life, Troy knew what it felt like to be truly hunted. Troy's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything but the deep, steady breathing of the beast before him. Moloch stood just a few feet away, his body low, his muscles coiled like a spring, ready to strike. The dog wasn't rushing. He was savoring the moment, savoring the fear. Troy's hands clawed at the locked door behind him, sweat making his fingers slick. There had to be a way in. There had to be. But when he turned the knob one last time, reality set in. He was trapped. Moloch took a slow step forward, then another. His growl was low, a vibration deep in his chest, a sound that sent ice through Troy's veins. He wasn't barking. He wasn't warning. This was the silence of a predator who had already won. Troy's back hit the door, his breath shuddering out of him. He had to think. Fast. His eyes darted to the side, a window. It was small, but if he could break it, crawl through. Moloch moved. A blur of muscle and fur lunged forward, and Troy barely reacted in time. He threw himself to the side, his shoulder slamming into the porch railing as jaws snapped inches from his ribs. The impact sent him sprawling onto the wooden planks, pain jolting through his bones. He gasped, rolling onto his hands and knees, but Moloch was already turning, already coming for him again. Troy's hands scrambled across the porch, fingers closing around a loose, rusted lantern. He didn't think, he just swung. The metal crashed against Moloch's face with a sickening crack. The dog let out a furious snarl, stumbling back, shaking his head. Not enough to stop him, just enough to buy a second. Troy used it. He ran. Not toward the woods, not toward the road, but straight through the window. Glass shattered around him as he threw himself through the narrow opening, his body crashing onto the wooden floor inside. Splinters tore at his skin, but he didn't stop moving. He crawled forward, his hands slipping on dust and debris. Behind him, Moloch let out a bone-chilling snarl, his claws scraping against the porch as he turned toward the window. He was coming through. Troy stumbled to his feet, his heart slamming against his ribs. The cabin was dark, abandoned, but he wasn't alone. A sound creaked from the shadows, slow and deliberate. Someone was there. He turned sharply, his breath caught in his throat. And that's when he saw it. The silhouette standing in the doorway, the shotgun glinting in the moonlight, and the low, amused voice that followed. Didn't think you'd make it this far. Troy's body locked up, his breath frozen in his throat. Ezekiel Harper stood in the doorway, his shotgun resting casually against his shoulder, eyes gleaming in the dim light. Behind him, the moonlight spilled through the broken window, casting jagged shadows across the floor. Moloch was there too, pacing outside like a caged beast, his breath fogging in the cold night air. But he didn't jump through the window. He didn't need to, because Troy had run straight into the real trap. Ezekiel took a slow step forward, his boots creaking against the rotting floorboards. "You know," he murmured, tilting his head, "I'll give you credit. Most men wouldn't have made it this far." His voice was calm, almost conversational, like he was talking about the weather. "But you see, that's the thing about rats. No matter how many holes they crawl through, they always end up right where you want him." Troy's mind screamed at him to move, to fight, to do something. But his body refused. The fear was suffocating. He knew there was no reasoning with this man. No begging. No pleading. Ezekiel had planned every second of this night, and Troy had done exactly what he wanted. His eyes flicked around the cabin. There had to be a way out. But the windows were too small. The only door, blocked by a man with a loaded shotgun. Moloch let out a low growl outside, pacing impatiently. He wanted his prize, but Ezekiel smirked and shook his head. "Not yet, boy," he muttered, his fingers tightening around the shotgun. "This one's mine." He lifted the barrel, pointing it directly at Troy's chest. This was it. No more running, no more fights, just the cold, empty finality of a shotgun blast. Troy was going to die in this rotting cabin, and no one would ever find his body. But then a sound. Faint, distant. Sirens. Ezekiel's expression flickered, his eyes narrowing. Troy's heart lurched. The cops. They were close, maybe even minutes away. Ezekiel exhaled sharply, jaw tightening. For the first time, his perfect little hunt was falling apart. Troy saw it, the hesitation, the second of doubt. And he knew it was his only chance. His last chance. If he didn't act now, he never would. With a sudden, desperate burst of adrenaline, Troy lunged forward. Not toward the door. Toward the shotgun. Toward Ezekiel. The old man's eyes widened in shock as Troy grabbed the barrel with both hands, shoving it away just as the blast erupted. The deafening explosion tore through the cabin, splintering wood, but the shot missed. The gun jerked back, and in the chaos, Troy threw his entire weight into Ezekiel, slamming him against the wall. The shotgun clattered to the floor. For the first time tonight, the hunter had lost control. And Troy wasn't done yet. Ezekiel staggered back, his body slamming against the wall as the shotgun clattered to the floor. For the first time, Troy saw something he hadn't seen before. Uncertainty in the old man's eyes. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Troy didn't hesitate, didn't think. He dove for the shotgun, his fingers grazing the cold metal, but Ezekiel was faster. The old man kicked the weapon away, sending it skidding across the cabin floor. Troy barely had time to react before a fist crashed into his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled backward, gasping, but Ezekiel was already on him. For an old man, he moved like a soldier because he was one. Another hit, a sharp blow to the side of Troy's head. Stars exploded behind his eyes. His legs buckled. This was it. But outside, a sudden, deafening bark. Moloch. For the briefest moment, Ezekiel turned his head toward the window, distracted by his own beast. And that was his mistake. Troy moved on pure instinct. He grabbed the rusted lantern from the floor and swung it with everything he had. The heavy metal crashed into Ezekiel's face, knocking him sideways with a grunt of pain. The old man collapsed against the table, blood dripping from his forehead. He wasn't dead, but he was down. Troy didn't wait to see if he'd get back up. He ran, barreling through the door, his legs weak, his chest burning. The sirens were closer now, red and blue lights flashing through the trees. But there was one last problem, Moloch. The beast was on the porch, blocking Troy's escape, snarling. His golden eyes filled with pure, merciless intent. Troy froze, his heart hammering, knowing this was his final obstacle. And then a second sound, a different whistle, not Ezekiel's. The police. Bright floodlights pierced the darkness, flashing directly at the cabin. Moloch's ears twitched. For the first time, hesitation. And in that hesitation, Troy moved. He didn't fight, didn't stop. He ran straight past the dog, down the steps, into the open, into the light, toward survival. Behind him, officers swarmed the cabin, their voices booming. "Put your hands up. Get on the ground." Troy didn't look back, didn't care what happened next. Ezekiel, Moloch, the house of death. It was all over. As he collapsed to his knees, his body shaking, his vision blurring, only one thought remained in his mind.